In this chapter and the next, we're going to focus on the idea of pure competition or perfect competition. In order to understand what pure or perfect competition means, we need to think about 4 market models that are ways that we can think about analyzing or grouping different kinds of markets or different kinds of firms. Pure competition is what we're focusing on now, but let's start by talking about that and see how it's different from some of these other ideas. So pure competition, we're trying to come up with a simple way of describing what would a market look like if it was just dog-eat-dog competition where firms were all selling exactly the same thing. So there are a lot of different firms. They're all selling the same thing. That's what we mean by a standardized or homogeneous product, is sometimes how this is described. And these firms, there's nothing keeping firms from coming in and producing this product and competing. And there's also nothing keeping firms from exiting this industry and going and doing something else. So it's like pure capitalism, pure freedom of movement, freedom of production, and there are a lot of people all producing the same thing. When we talk about supply and demand, what we are usually thinking of is a perfectly or purely competitive market. We call firms in this kind of market price takers. And what a price taker means is, since we're talking about supply and demand, we know that when there's the demand and supply for a product, there is a market equilibrium price. These perfectly or purely competitive firms are going to be taking that market price as given. They can't affect it. Why not? Well, let's think about these assumptions that we're talking about again. There are a lot of firms. They're all selling exactly the same thing. And let's suppose that the market price, where the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied are the same at that equilibrium price. Let's suppose the equilibrium price is, say, $10. If there are a lot of firms all selling exactly the same thing, and I, as one of those little firms, decide, hey, I'm going to raise my price to $11, what's going to happen? Yeah, nobody's going to buy anything from me. Now, I could lower my price, but why would I? Because, as we'll see in a minute, what this is going to imply is that if I'm just one little firm out of many, and there's a market price that I'm taking as given that I cannot affect, what that means is that I can sell as many as I would like to at that market price of $10. So I could lower my price, sure, but why would I? Why sell for a lower price when you can sell for the market price of $10? And this will make a little bit more sense as we go through and analyze some situations. Now, the opposite extreme assumption would be there's not a lot of firms all selling the same thing. There is just one firm. So at the very opposite extreme, we have what we call a pure monopoly. In a pure monopoly, there's one big firm. They are the only person selling a product or some kind of service, and there are no close substitutes. Now, the no close substitutes assumption is saying that if there was a firm and we're calling it a monopolist, say Coca-Cola, it doesn't make a lot of sense to call them a monopolist because there are close substitutes to Coca-Cola. There's Pepsi, there's RC Cola, there are other soft drinks, there are other things you could drink altogether. So when there are a lot of close substitutes, we're not going to call that a monopoly, okay? What we want to think about is an extreme situation where if you want to buy this product, you must buy it from the one person who controls the market. Which brings up the question, why is there only one firm producing in this market? Well, there must be something blocking entry from other firms coming in. Maybe there's a law saying that you can't produce this product. There's only one firm that's allowed. Maybe people have a patent or a copyright on this product, and that's why there's only one firm allowed. There are a lot of reasons why there might just be one big monopoly, and we'll talk more about that when we study monopolies in a couple of weeks. Now, there are 2 other common options that we see that aren't the extreme of a lot of little firms all selling the same thing with cutthroat competition, or just one big firm, and they can choose the price they want. We call them price makers. In between these two are another couple of options called monopolistic competition and oligopoly. Monopolistic competition, you see the two words we choose to describe it here, pick the monopoly word and the competition word and kind of slam them together. What we mean is that there are a lot of firms, maybe not so many as in pure competition. The big difference is the product people are selling is differentiated. Differentiated means each firm is selling a slightly different version or a slightly different brand. And this is a case where you would care about the brand that you're buying. So if people are selling a similar product, but they're not exactly the same, we might call that monopolistic competition. A good example would be shoes. Not all shoes are just shoes. There are a lot of brands of shoes, and shoes have different features. They're all a little different, or differentiated as we'd call it. So when you care about the type that you're buying, or you care about the brand that you're buying, you're more than likely thinking about monopolistic competition. So there are a bunch of firms all selling slightly different things. Another option is oligopoly. So unlike a monopoly, that first part of mono means one, right? So monopoly. Oli, this prefix here, means a few or several. So an oligopoly is an industry where there's a few firms. Now, how many is a few? Well, could be 2 or 3 or 10. The important thing isn't the exact number. It's the fact that production is controlled by a small enough number of firms to where these firms could possibly get together and collude or coordinate their prices. So with an oligopoly, there's a few firms and there's a small enough number of firms producing that if one of the firms were to raise or cut their price, the other firms would feel that impact directly on their sales. And since firms are affected by the prices of their rivals, sometimes these oligopolies, if there are 3 or 4 of them, they'll get worried that, say, if one company lowers their price, they feel like they have to respond by cutting their price as well, and so they might get into a price war. But on the other extreme, these firms might get together and say, hey, let's stop fighting. How about we all raise our prices up, and then we'll all be able to make more profits. So here's a table that outlines most of these common features here to think about. Make sure you get very familiar with this table. So just to run through this again very briefly, in pure or perfect competition, there are a very large number of firms all selling the same thing. They have no control over their price. There's a market price that they take as given. It's very easy for people to get into or out of this industry. There's not really any non-price competition. Non-price competition would be something like advertising. If you're selling wheat, or if you're selling corn, and corn is corn and wheat is wheat, there's no reason for you to advertise your product because what you're selling is exactly the same as what everyone else is selling. And this is the most common example we give of pure competition, are standardized farm products like wheat or rice or corn or soybeans. There's a market price, and that's what you're going to sell your product at. On the other extreme over here, pure monopoly, there's one big firm. What they're selling is unique. There are no good substitutes for this. And their control over price is very strong, but it depends on the price elasticity of demand. So a monopolist can choose any price they want. They are a price maker, as we call them. However, the monopolist still has to live by the fact that there is a demand curve for their product, right? So here's price, here's quantity. Suppose this is the demand for their product. And suppose here this intercept for the demand curve is at $100. So yes, the monopoly can choose any price they want, But they have to realize that the law of demand is still going to hold, that as the price goes up, the quantity is going to go down, and if they try to charge over $100, they will sell nothing. So it's kind of a fallacy to think that monopolists can charge anything they want. Yeah, they can, but they are still controlled by the law of demand. Why is there one big firm? Well, there are a lot of reasons we'll go through when we talk about monopolies in more detail, but entry is blocked. There's something keeping other firms out. Again, it could be a law, patent, or copyright or something like that. What about non-price competition? Would a monopolist have a reason to advertise? Yeah, probably. One of the things that monopolists can do by advertising is actually increase the demand for their product. And if you can increase the demand for your own product, then that is going to increase the prices that you can charge people, right? So advertising is probably a good idea if you're a monopolist. But also monopolists have to worry about their image. People can get mad if there's only one firm and they're charging high prices to people and maybe they're not providing good service to people either. They might have to invest in a public relations agency in order to try to make people think that they're not this evil monopoly that, well, maybe they are. So what are some examples of pure monopolies? Well, local utilities. Think about your cable provider. Think about your phone provider if you actually still have a landline in your house. Think about the electricity provider. These local utilities are usually monopolies because there's a law saying there's only going to be one electric company, there's only going to be one cable company in an area. And the reason these laws exist is it just doesn't make sense to run separate power lines to everybody's house from 3 or 4 different companies. It doesn't make sense to run separate cable lines from several companies to different people's houses. Unless it's like a major urban area, then possibly that could make sense. Also, it could be a patented product, like I was saying. So if you invent a drug to cure a certain disease, then while that patent is in effect, you are a monopolist and no one else is allowed to sell that drug without your permission. And so you're a price maker. You can charge any price you want. But you, again, have to understand that as you raise the price, people are going to buy less. Now, these two options that are kind of somewhere in the middle, monopolistic competition, a lot of firms selling differentiated goods, different versions of the same thing that matter to you. There's some control over price, but it depends on how differentiated the goods are. So if you think about shoes, shoes are pretty differentiated, and so some people can charge thousands of dollars for really fancy shoes. So there is some price control, but in order to charge a higher price, you have to be selling something that's really good and really unique. How hard or easy is it to get into a monopolistic competition industry? Pretty easy, I guess. You could get into an industry like making shoes if you wanted to. It's not going to be extremely simple, going to cost you some money, but you could certainly do it. But with monopolistic competition, one of the hard things is there is a lot of emphasis on advertising and brand names and trademarks. How is it that Nike and Reebok and these other companies can sell their shoes for a higher price than no-name brands? They invest millions and millions of dollars in advertising. So examples of monopolistically competitive industries would be clothes, especially shoes, breakfast cereals, a lot of advertising going on there. So we could also think about video games. There are a lot of different manufacturers of video games, but the games they put out are all going to be very different and of interest to very different people. So with oligopoly, there are only a few firms. And even though they could be selling differentiated products, we usually think about oligopolies as economists as selling more standardized things. That's not always true, though. What about their pricing power? Well, their pricing power is pretty limited because there are other people selling very similar things, and there aren't a lot of other firms, so they don't have a lot of other things to choose from. However, There's always the threat of a price war, that if I decide that I want to cut my price, since there's this interdependence, there's only a few firms, and when I do anything with my price, these other few firms, they're going to feel it. They're going to notice that I've changed my price, and they're going to respond in some way. So it's quite possible that if I raise my price, they could start an advertising campaign talking about what a rotten company I am. If I cut my price, this could lead to a price war where they cut their price even further, and that's not going to help me out. So you can never change your price in a vacuum. You have to consider the response of these other few firms. However, there is the possibility of collusion, and this is one of the big reasons why we study oligopolies, is that it's quite easy for these firms to get together and agree, hey, let's all raise our prices by 50%, and that way we'll all make higher profits. Now, in most countries, this is illegal. However, actually proving that this is happening can be quite hard. So what are some examples of this? Well, the steel industry is one that historically has had just a few big producers, at least in the United States, because you have to have a huge steel factory in order to get economies of scale, which means the bigger the factory, the more cheaply you can produce steel. So it kind of naturally lends itself to just having a few very large producers. The automobile industry, automobiles, I don't know, are they standardized or differentiated? Well, in one way you could think that most companies have their standard smallish car and their mid-size car and their kind of large family car, and most companies have their minivan, and minivans are pretty darn similar. On the other hand, these companies do invest a lot of money in truly differentiating their products with research and development, or at least in advertising to try to convince us that their products are different. So automobiles, computer chip makers, for example, processors for computers, there are only a few big companies controlling those markets. Also memory chips for phones and for desktop computers and laptop computers, there's only a few firms that control those markets. Also household appliances. Try to think about how many different companies make refrigerators and ovens and things like that. And even if you can think about quite a few brand names, the actual companies making those products are much more limited. So many of the brand names you're familiar with are actually controlled by just one company. So the last kind of thing to think about with whether something is going to be monopolistic competition or oligopoly is really what percentage of the market is controlled by a small number of firms. So we might call something an oligopoly even if there are 100 firms, if it's the case that, say, the largest two firms control more than 80 or 90% of the market, right? That would still be an oligopoly. Even though there are a lot of firms, there might only be 2 or 3 major players, and everybody else is just so small that they don't matter. So some people would say that breakfast cereals are more like an oligopoly, because there are a few large companies, at least in the United States, that make most of the breakfast cereals. So again, there are some fuzzy lines. It's very hard to find an example that you can perfectly place in one of these 4 baskets. A lot of times it's going to be debatable, but the most important thing is to be able to understand these characteristics and be able to argue which one do you think it is. And when it comes to things like quizzes and tests, we'll make sure that the examples are as clear as possible. So what we're going to focus on in this class are the 2 extremes, pure competition and monopoly, because they are the easiest to analyze. They're more simple and more clear-cut. In pure competition, you have a lot of tiny firms who all take the market price as given. They have no influence over the price. They just have to decide at that market price, how many should I produce? And then on the other hand, you have monopoly. There's only one big firm, and they have to decide 2 things. What price should they charge? And depending on what price they charge, that is going to dictate the quantity that they can sell because of the demand curve, right? So let's start digging into pure competition to see what are the issues that we need to address when we're analyzing a firm in this market. And then we're going to look at all the little firms in a market and see how they come together to create the supply curve in the market. Just to reiterate a couple of these points, since each little firm can't affect the market price by itself, it takes the market price as a given and fixed. I am so small, I can't affect it. If the market price is $10, okay, how many should I produce if the price is $10, if I can sell them for $10? So the demand for one little firm's output is going to be perfectly elastic. Perfectly elastic means infinitely responsive. What that means is I, as one little firm, can sell as much as I want, infinite amount if I want, at the market price of, say, $10. But if I raise my price even a penny to $10.01, the demand for me is going to go down to zero, right? No one will want to buy from me at $10.01 if they can buy from my neighbor at $10. What we're going to be figuring out here is, given the cost structure, given a cost table, like we looked at in the previous chapter, how much does each little firm want to produce? We also want to think about, what does the demand curve for one firm look like? Let's go ahead and tackle that one right now. If I am one little firm and I am asking, what does my demand, not the demand for all the product in the market, but demand to buy from me, what quantity do people want to buy from me at each price? Then again, if that market price is $10, as we said, I can sell as many as I want at a price of $10. I could sell 3, I could sell 20, I could sell 1,000,000 if that's what I wanted. Graph not drawn to scale, of course, right? So my demand curve, in other words, the demand curve for each individual little firm, is going to be a horizontal line at the market price. I can sell any quantity. People will demand as much as I want to sell at that market price. Now that assumption makes sense because I am so small, I can't actually produce enough to where I'm going to matter. What is the supply curve for one firm going to look like? We'll address that in the next video. What is the shape of a firm's total cost curve, and what is the shape of a firm's total revenue curve? Let's go ahead and address those now. Now in the next video, we're going to look at a new cost table, and we're going to look at all these things again: fixed costs, variable costs, average fixed, average variable, average total, and marginal cost. But let's just look at this total cost table here for a moment to get a big picture view of what's going on. Here's that same total cost table that we were looking at down here just by itself, and let's see, what would it look like if we were to graph those total costs for each number of units we might want to produce. Let's graph in blue the total cost curve. So what does this look like? Normally, for most businesses, the most common kind of shape that we see when it comes to total cost is something kind of like an S shape, although it's more lying on its side. So we usually see with total cost that it goes up pretty steeply to begin with, and then it starts to flatten out, and then it starts getting steeper and steeper and steeper and steeper again. Now these points, see if you remember this from math class, these points where a curve stops getting steeper and starts getting flatter, so here it's steeper, 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 here it's flatter, 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 those points where that change occurs we call an inflection point. Inflection point. So there's one here where it stops getting steeper and steeper and starts getting flatter and flatter, and then we see that the slope starts to get steeper and steeper and steeper again, somewhere around here. So there are 2 inflection points in most total cost curves that we look at in the real world. Now what about total revenue? I said let's assume here that one of these perfectly competitive firms saw a market price of $350. The orange curve represents total revenue for that firm. And total revenue is going to go up as they sell more units. And it's a straight line because when it sells one more unit, its total revenue goes up by $350. So we go over 1, up 350, over 1, up 350. And the firm, if it's a perfectly competitive firm, can keep doing this indefinitely. So the total revenue is a straight line, and total cost is kind of this snaky curve with two bends in it, right? One bend down here and one bend up here. And if you're a firm, what you're trying to do is trying to maximize profit. And profit is just the difference between total revenue minus total cost. So what a firm would be doing is trying to find the point where, if we zoom in here, where is the place where there's the biggest difference between the total revenue curve here in orange and the total cost curve here in blue. We want to find the biggest gap between those because that gap is profit. Well, let's just look at a few points here. Down here, if they were producing 5 units, it looks like there's not a lot of difference there between total revenue and total cost. At 6 units, a little bit bigger difference. 7 units, a little bigger. 8, I'm guessing that's a little less. So my guess, based on this graph, would be let's produce 7 units, and that's going to be where our profit is going to be maximized when the price is $350. Now, if there was a different price, the answer would be a different number of units, right? Now, this is one way to try to answer the question, how much should we produce in order to maximize our profit? We could calculate the total revenue for every possible number of outputs and look at the total cost and just calculate the profit for every possibility and then figure out which one maximizes our profit. Turns out there's a better way, especially when you're not dealing with a simple example like this where we only have 10 possible choices, right? If you're a real company, you're probably going to have thousands of different amounts that you could possibly produce, so this could get a bit tedious. What we want you to learn is a different way, and that's what we're going to focus on in our next video, looking at a cost table, average variable cost, average total cost, marginal cost. Turns out there are some simple rules we're going to learn that will help us figure out how many units to produce and to be able to determine very, very quickly, are we going to be able to make a profit and how much? So I hope you join me for that video. As always, if you have any questions about what we were talking about here, please let me know. This is Dr. Berkey signing out, and I wish you the best of luck with your studies.